few years ago, I got really into wave runners. I like things that go real fast. I'm not impressed with jewelry. I'm not impressed with furs. But man, you give me something that goes fast, and I love it. So I got into wave runners because they go fast on the water. First experience I had with a wave runner was down in Panama City, Florida, when my husband, who's a pastor now, was a youth minister, and he took a group down there. And there was a guy that was in college that went with us, good-looking guy. And he rented a wave runner, and he went all up and down that beach on that wave runner. And when he came back in, I said, would you mind taking me for a ride on that? He said, no, sure, get on. I got on, put my arms around him. We went out in the ocean, and we just rode up and down. It was so much fun. All of a sudden, that thing went dead. Dead as a doornail, dead. And he said, we're going to have to get off. I said, into the water? He said, yeah. I said, that's where the sharks live. I ain't getting in that water. He said, you got to. I got to turn it over and get the seaweed out of it. So we got into the water. He turned it over, and he pulled the seaweed and pulled the seaweed, and then he sat it back up. And he got on it, and he reached back to get me, and he couldn't get me on there. I ain't saying it was my fault. He was very weak. And he kept pulling, and finally he got me on there. But the whole time I was in that water, I was thinking, if we die out here and our bodies get washed ashore, everybody's going to walk by and say, what is that old woman doing with that young, good-looking boy? But anyway, we finally got up, got me on it, and then he reached down to crank it. Wouldn't crank. And I just about panicked. And he said, no problem. He said, I know what the problem is. I said, what? He said, I don't have the kill switch in. I said, what's the kill switch? And he showed me, and he had dangling from his arm a little coiled cord, and at the end of it was a little plastic key. And he said, if this key is not inserted into that slot, this won't start. I said, what's the purpose of that? He said, well, it's so if you're riding and you fall off the wave runner will stop because that'll come out. It's pretty good. I learned a lesson that day. So my next experience with the wave runner was many years later, and I was at a retreat with a bunch of women, and the woman that owned the home had wave runners. So we got out there on the river, and she showed me how to do all this cool stuff like whirly dips and slides and all this stuff, and man, I learned all these tricks, but Tim wasn't there to see it. So a few months later, we went on a cruise, and I said, I want to do an excursion where we could ride wave runners so I can show you what I can do. He said, okay. So we chose an excursion called the Everything Cool Beach Break. Everything Cool. Now, he went and rented the wave runner, and in my defense, I was not there to hear the instructions. So what happened is not my fault. I am innocent. After we rode around all day with him driving, I said, would you let me drive this and show you some of the things I know how to do on the wave runner? He said, all right. So he sat on the beach, and he watched me as I pulled out. Now, I'm going to remind you again, I didn't hear the instructions. And I didn't hear that man when he said, don't go over there. If you go over there, you'll be arrested. I did not hear that. Well, over there was the cruise ship. And there might be some people on that cruise ship that would want to see me do all my tricks too. So when I got on that wave runner, I took off and went over that way. I got out there and I did all kind of little whirly dips and spins and everything. And when I looked back, everybody on the beach was going like this. I thought they was cheering me on, and so I waved back. Hey, how y'all doing? Woo, ain't this fun? About that time, that man that ran the place got on his wave runner, and he came out there just bellowing out there to me. And he got even with me, and he said, did you not see me wave at you? I said, yeah, did you see me waving And he said, "You're going to jail." And I said, "What?" So we came on into shore. My husband was standing there, and he looked at me and he said, "You see that ship over there?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "I'm getting on it, and I will leave you here to rot in this jail." I said, "You can't leave me here. You a preacher. What do they say about you if you leave me here in a jail?" So he went over and talked to the man. The man said, "Okay, if you'll get her out of here right now, you can take her." So we start walking back to the ship, and the first thing on my mind is I wanted to look at that guy and say, "Well, apparently not everything is cool," because that wasn't what you just did. So we got back from our cruise, and a year or so later, we bought a house on a lake. And I said, "Let's buy us our own wave runners." So we did. We bought 2 bright red wave runners, those kinds that's got the rooster tail coming out of the back that the water comes up. And we rode those things all summer long, had a ball on them. And at the end of the summer, to get them out of the water, we had a process. We were 72 steps from our house down to the lake. And here's what we did. The boat launch was over this way. So Tim said, "Here's what I'll do. I'll come down and get everything prepped to get the wave runners out of the water. Then I'm going to drive the car over to the boat launch. And you ride one wave runner over there and then put me on the back and come back and we'll get the other one." I said, "Okay." He took the phones. He took everything like that, and I kept the key to both wave runners. Well, he left, but before he left, he looked at me and he said, "Do not unhook this wave runner from this dock until you make sure it's going to start." I said, "Okay." He turned around and walked up. I just reached over and unhooked it. And it was on the main stream of the river, so it just sort of pulled me out into the river. And I start floating down the river, and I reached down to crank it. Nothing. Dead. And I'm like, "Oh, golly, I'm dead. I'm just dead." And it was taking me so quickly down the river. And remember, I'd given him the phones. I couldn't call him. And even if I called him, I had the key to both wave runners with me, so he didn't have any way to come and get me. So I'm just floating down the river. And I floated up under the neighbor's pier. And I got up under that pier, and I grabbed hold of it. And I held onto that pier for 30 minutes before he realized something's wrong. And then finally I see him. And he walks down 72 steps. And he comes out to the end of my pier, and he can't see because I'm up under the neighbor's pier. And he comes out and he does this. And I said, "Hey!" He didn't hear me. So I took the edge of that thing and I pulled myself out from under that pier. And I looked over and I said, "Hey!" By this time I'm floating again rapidly. And he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "It wouldn't start." Everybody in this room knows what he said next. "I told you not to unhook it from the dock until you made sure it was going to start." Well, it made me so mad. So I just reached up and I said, "Well, what do you expect me to do?" And about that time, I saw that kill switch on that cord dangling. And I remembered what that young man had taught me so many years before, that wave runner will not start unless that plastic key is in that slot. And I saw it about the same time he saw it. And the look on his face would have him arrested. He was so mad. And I reached down and I put the key in the slot and I cranked it and I drove by as I watched him stomping up 72 steps. And the thought that went through my mind was, he has a completely different idea in his mind for the term kill switch.